So today we're going to start talking about the structure and function of large biological molecules. And if you think back to our last lecture, which was the chemical context of life, we remind ourselves that molecules are two or more atoms that are chemically bonded by something called. So this lecture is fairly long, but really what we're going to do is we're going to break this entire lecture up into four different types of macromolecules. And as you can see here, the four types of macromolecules we'll talk about are carbohydrates, lipids, proteins, and nucleic acids. And we kind of mentioned at the beginning what a molecule was, but what is this macromolecule we're talking about? Well, a macromolecule is a giant biological molecule that's composed of smaller individual molecules, and they tend to be pretty complex in structure. So, in biology, when people talk about a macromolecule, they're typically talking about one of these four types. So, one thing we're going to talk about and we're going to learn is that 3 out of our 4 macromolecules form these long chains that we call polymers. But let's give a definition to a polymer. A polymer is a long molecule made up of many similar or identical building blocks that are linked by covalent bonds. And so that's a confusing definition, but really, I like to think of a polymer as kind of like a beaded necklace. Okay, the entire necklace, every individual bead that makes up the necklace. So we're kind of looking at the big picture here is what they're referring to as the polymer. And then within that polymer, we have those individual beads within the necklace. And that's what we're going to refer to as a monomer. And here it says monomers are the repeating units of the polymer. So an easy way to remember it is to just, you can draw a beaded necklace if you want. And to remember that those individual building blocks that make up a macromolecule are the individual beads, and we call those monomers. When we look at the entire picture, the entire macromolecule, the entire necklace, we're going to give that the name polymer. So, how do we create these macromolecules or these polymers? Well, we do that by this process called a condensation reaction. And here it says, monomers are connected by a reaction in which two molecules are covalently bonded to each other through the loss of a water molecule. So if you have your notes in front of you, underline through the loss of a water molecule. That's kind of a really important part I want you to grasp from this slide. And this overall process is something they call a condensation or a dehydration reaction. If you think about that name, dehydration reaction, it's pretty appropriate since we're losing a water molecule. So this is just an illustration of that condensation or that dehydration reaction we talked about. So if we're wanting to build a polymer, you can see on top, again, these pictures look like a beaded necklace, right? We will work with something that's familiar to us. So we have on the left top side of the picture, we have a shorter polymer that has 3 beads. And on the upper right-hand side, we have one unlinked monomer that needs to be connected. And so what happens is that through this dehydration reaction, that hydrogen atom and then the hydroxide group on the other side are going to leave and produce a water molecule, which is going to link that entire chain together, and that's going to help us to build our big polymer or our big macromolecule. So the second process we're going to talk about is called hydrolysis. And hydrolysis is also important, but we're going to note that it's the exact opposite process of that condensation/dehydration reaction we just talked about. So in our dehydration reaction, we were building polymers. We were building these macromolecules we're going to talk about in more detail. Well, in hydrolysis, we're going to do the exact opposite. We're going to break them apart. So a kind of a common day example of why we might want to break apart macromolecules is digestion. So when you eat food, your body needs to be able to break it apart so that it can obtain the nutrients and just all those different components that we require as a living organism. And we do that through this process called hydrolysis. So it says polymers are disassembled to monomers by hydrolysis, a process that is the reverse of the dehydration reaction. And instead of losing a water molecule, this time we're going to add a water molecule so that we can break apart those individual building blocks or those individual monomers. So in this illustration, you can see it's the opposite of the one we just looked at. We're starting with an entire chain, okay, our entire necklace, and we need to break it apart. So the way we're going to do that is through this process called hydrolysis. So we're going to add our water molecule, and it's going to break apart some of our individual building blocks or our monomers.